When Agnes Wren spent every dollar she had on the most run-down house in Kettle Creek, her daughter didn't speak to her for 3 weeks. Agnes steps through the front door of the Varnell house on a Tuesday morning in October, carrying a flashlight, a notepad, and a measuring tape. She does not look at the peeling paint or the warped floorboards or the water stain on the parlor ceiling that the previous inspector had flagged as a structural concern. She looks at the bones, the load-bearing walls, the proportions of the rooms, the way the staircase was built solid and centered and wider than strictly necessary, the way staircases were built by people who intended the house to last. She moves through each room, slowly making notes in a small, precise hand, and she looks like someone cataloging, not decorating. Sylvia Varnell built this house in 1931 and lived in it alone for 56 years. When she died in 1987, her estate was settled quickly. Her family said she hadn't left much of value. 3 different owners tried the Varnell house after that. None stayed longer than 2 years. The last one left in 1999 without explanation, and the house sat empty for 25 years, accumulating the particular reputation of a property that everyone in Kettle Creek had an opinion about and no one wanted to own. Agnes was the only buyer who did not ask for a discount. She was also the only one who brought a measuring tape on the first walkthrough. On her second visit, Agnes walks the second-floor hallway with a different kind of purpose. She is not looking at the rooms. She is counting her steps. The east bedroom is 11 feet deep, measured from the doorframe to the exterior wall. She goes outside and measures the same section from the foundation. The exterior dimension allows for 16 feet. She writes both numbers in her notepad and stands in the hallway for a moment, looking at the wall at the far end. 5 feet, unaccounted for. She turns to the wallpaper at the end of the hall. 3 layers, she can see it at the baseboard where a strip has peeled away. She taps the plaster once, then twice. Then she moves 6 inches and taps again. Stone sounds dead. Open wall sounds hollow. This sounds like a door. Under 3 layers of wallpaper and a smooth skim of fresh plaster sealed from the outside with no handle visible, no hinge line, no hardware of any kind, a room. Not a closet, not a mechanical space. A room with proportions that suggest it was built deliberately, finished deliberately, and sealed just as deliberately. And just inside the threshold where the plaster dust has settled in the undisturbed air of a space that has not been opened in decades, a cedar chest, padlocked. With a handwritten paper label taped to the lid in neat, careful cursive, the ink faded but legible. The letters formed with the unhurried precision of someone who had spent a lifetime writing things meant to be read clearly. SV for the record. In case. Agnes looks at those 4 words for a long time. She does not open the chest, not yet. She takes out her notepad and writes down exactly what she sees in the order she sees it, the way she was trained to do 30 years ago, in a county archive room where the first rule was that you never touch a document before you have described it completely. Then she sits down on the floor of the sealed room in the plaster dust and the October light coming through a single small window that looks out over the back garden. And she understands that she is the first person to stand in this room since Sylvia Varnell sealed it from the outside sometime before 1987, and that Sylvia Varnell had expected someone to find it. She had simply been waiting for the right someone. If you want to know what was in that cedar chest and what 4 words written on a paper label meant for the next 37 years of this property's history, stay with us, because this is where the story begins. Agnes Wren had not made the decision quickly. She had driven past the Varnell house 11 times over the course of 4 months before she called the listing agent. She had done it the way she did most things that mattered, methodically, letting the evidence accumulate before she committed to a conclusion. The house was on the corner of Sycamore and Mill, set back from the road behind a row of overgrown boxwoods that had not been trimmed in years, and it had the look of a property that had given up trying to impress anyone a long time ago. The porch sagged on the left side. The paint had gone past, peeling into something closer to erosion. The upstairs windows had the particular opacity of glass that has not been cleaned in decades. None of that was what Agnes had been looking at. She had been looking at the roofline, the proportions, the way the house sat on its foundation with a solidity that newer construction rarely achieved. Someone had built this house to be permanent, and the permanence was still there underneath everything that time and neglect had done to the surface. Agnes had spent 35 years in a county archive, learning to see past the condition of a thing to the structure underneath it, and the structure of the Varnell house was exceptional. She requested the full title history on a Thursday afternoon. She read it at her kitchen table over 2 evenings the way she read anything that mattered, slowly and in order, following the chain of ownership from Sylvia Varnell's original deed in 1931, forward through 3 subsequent owners to the present listing. The chain itself was unremarkable. What stopped her was the probate record from 1988. Sylvia Varnell had lived in that house for 56 years. 56 years of a woman who, according to every account Agnes could find in the county historical records, had been organized, deliberate, and meticulous about her affairs. A former elementary school principal, a woman who had served on the county library board for 20 years and the historical society for a decade, a woman who by every indication in the public record kept things. The 1988 probate inventory listed furniture, household goods, a small savings account, and a 1979 Ford sedan. No personal papers, no documents, no records of any kind. Agnes had sat with that absence for a long time. In 35 years of archival work, she had learned one thing above most others. The absence of a document is not the same as the absence of information. When a record that should exist does not appear in an inventory, there are 2 possibilities. Either it was never created, or it was moved before someone could list it. For a woman who had kept a house for 56 years, the absence of every personal document was not an oversight. It was a decision. Agnes made an offer the following Monday. Full asking price, no requests for concessions. She closed 6 weeks later on the first Tuesday of October with a cashier's check for $87,000, representing the entirety of what she had saved over 35 years of county employment. Diane arrived on move-in day in a car packed with cleaning supplies and the particular energy of a daughter who has accepted a situation she has not stopped being alarmed by. She stood in the front doorway for a long moment, taking in the warped floorboards and the water-stained ceiling and the smell of a house that had been closed for 25 years, and then she looked at her mother. "Mom," she said, "please tell me this isn't real." "The bones are exceptional," Agnes said. "Come look at the staircase." Diane did not look at the staircase. She set down her cleaning supplies and sat on the bottom step and looked at the ceiling with the expression of someone recalculating a situation they had hoped would recalculate itself. Agnes went to look at the staircase alone. It was everything she had expected. Wide-centered, built with mortise and tenon joinery at every connection point, the kind of work that did not happen by accident. 2 days later, the letter arrived. It was addressed to current owner or occupant, forwarded from the listing agent's office, with a yellow sticker indicating it had arrived the day after the deed was recorded in the county system. Agnes stood at the kitchen counter and read it once, then read it again. Owen Varnell, Richmond, Virginia. A single type paragraph offering to purchase the Varnell house at full asking price. Cash, no inspection required, with a proposed closing timeline of 14 days. A phone number and an email address. No explanation of his interest, no mention of his connection to the property. Agnes turned the letter over and looked at the blank back of the page for a moment. Then she set it on the kitchen counter face down and went back to her measuring tape. She had spent 35 years in the county archive. She had processed hundreds of real estate transactions, seen every variety of offer and counteroffer and negotiating position that the property market in a small Virginia county could produce. She knew what a cash offer with no inspection contingency meant in ordinary circumstances. It meant a buyer with resources and confidence. She knew what it meant when that offer arrived within 48 hours of a deed recording before the new owner had spent a single night in the house, from a man who shared a surname with the woman who had built it. It meant someone already knew what was inside and was willing to pay full price to make sure nobody else looked first. Cal Drummond had been assessing old houses in Kettle Creek for 22 years, and he had learned to present bad news to new owners with a particular, calibrated directness that was honest without being discouraging. He had delivered foundation reports, roof assessments, load-bearing wall concerns, and electrical system evaluations to people who had just spent their savings on something they loved, and he had learned that what people needed in those moments was clarity, not softening. He called Agnes up to the second floor on the third morning of the assessment with that same directness. He had his diagram on a clipboard, a hand-drawn floor plan of the east wing with his measurements penciled in at each dimension. He showed it to her without preamble. Running the numbers for the roof load calculation, he said, "The east bedroom is measuring 11 feet deep interior, but the exterior dimension on that side of the house," he tapped the exterior wall notation on his diagram, "allows for 16. I've run it 3 times." He set the clipboard down on the bedroom windowsill and looked at her. 5 feet unaccounted for, he said, between the interior bedroom wall and the exterior. It's consistent the whole length of the east wing. Not a taper, not a structural irregularity. Consistent. Agnes took the clipboard and looked at the diagram. She looked at it for 4 seconds. Then she held out her hand. "Your tape measure," she said. Cal unclipped it from his belt and gave it to her without asking why. She went to the east bedroom first and ran the tape herself carefully from the interior face of the east wall to the door frame. 11 feet 2 inches. She wrote it in her notepad. Then she went downstairs and out through the side door and stood on the ground below the east wing with the tape extended against the foundation, measuring from the exterior face of the same wall across to the far corner. 16 feet 1 inch. She wrote that down too. She stood outside for a moment looking up at the second floor roof line. The exterior proportions of the house were symmetrical and deliberate. There was nothing in the roof line that suggested a framing error or an irregular structural accommodation. The house looked exactly like a house that had been designed with 5 additional feet on the east side of the second floor and built precisely to that design. She went back upstairs. Cal was in the east bedroom doorway with his arms crossed, watching her with the expression of a man who was recalibrating his read on a client. "Probably a framing error from the original build," he said. "Happens in old houses. They eyeballed a lot of it back then." Agnes stood at the far end of the upstairs hallway looking at the wallpaper at the east end. 3 layers visible at the baseboard, she had noted that on her first visit. The topmost layer was a faded cream, with a small repeating pattern, the kind of wallpaper that had been fashionable in the early 1970s. Sylvia Varnell was the daughter of a surveyor, Agnes said. She didn't eyeball anything. Cal was quiet for a moment. "How do you know that he said?" Agnes kept her eyes on the wallpaper. "I read her obituary before I made the offer," she said. She heard Cal shift his weight in the doorway behind her, but she was already focused on the wall. She walked toward it slowly, the way she walked toward a shelf in the archive, when she had a strong suspicion about what she was going to find and did not want to move faster than her certainty. She stopped when she was close enough to see the texture of the wallpaper clearly. The surface was flat and unbroken. No visible seam, no discoloration line, no hardware impression. Whoever had sealed whatever was behind this wall had done it carefully, finishing the surface to blend with the surrounding hallway in a way that would satisfy a casual inspection. But Agnes was not conducting a casual inspection. She pressed her palm flat against the wallpaper at the point where the door would logically be if a room of that depth had a standard proportion entrance at its center. She felt it immediately. Not hardware, not a hinge. The faintest discontinuity in the resistance of the wall beneath her hand, a place where the surface gave fractionally differently than the solid plaster on either side. The ghost of a frame, buried under layers of material, but still present in the way that structural things remain present in the resistance, in the weight. In the particular way, a wall that is also a door responds when you press your hand against it and pay attention. She stood with her palm on the wall for a long moment. Then she took out her notepad and wrote down the dimensions one more time. 11 feet 2 inches interior, 16 feet 1 inch exterior, 5 feet unaccounted for behind the east wall of the second floor. A room that appeared on no blueprint she had been able to locate had not appeared in any of the 3 inspection reports filed during the previous ownership periods and had not been referenced in 37 years of property records in the Kettle Creek County system. A room that Sylvia Varnell, daughter of a surveyor, had built and sealed and never mentioned to anyone who wrote anything down. Agnes spent her entire savings on this house, and she did it because she saw something in the paperwork that nobody else had bothered to read. She has not yet told Diane about the measurement. She has not yet told anyone. If you have ever trusted your instincts when everyone around you was doubtful, stay with us. Hit subscribe and the bell, so you do not miss what is on the other side of that wall. Agnes did not call anyone to help with the wallpaper. She bought the stripper solution and the wide scraper at the hardware store on Thursday morning and was back at the Varnell house by 10. She started at the baseboard on the east end of the hallway, the way she started any archival project at the beginning, working forward in order not skipping sections because something looked unimportant. She worked on her knees with a drop cloth under her and a small spray bottle and the wide scraper, and she moved with the methodical patience of someone who has spent a career handling things that could not be replaced. The first layer came away in long strips. Cream background, small, repeating geometric pattern, the kind of wallpaper that had been in every catalog from 1988 to 1995. She recognized it immediately and set the strips aside and moved to the second layer. The second layer was older, a faded yellow with a stylized floral pattern that she dated to the early 1970s without having to think about it. She had cataloged enough period interior photographs in 35 years of archival work to read wallpaper the way other people read clothing. This layer had been applied over the original wall, which meant someone had redecorated the hallway around 1971 or 1972 and had papered over everything, including the end wall, without exception. Without exception was the detail that mattered. She kept working. The second layer thinned near the baseboard, and she could see the edge of a third layer beneath it. The original, a soft sage green with a simple arts and crafts border that she placed immediately in the early 1930s, consistent with the house's construction date. She worked along the baseboard, carefully lifting the edge of the 1970s layer to see how far the original extended. It stopped 6 inches from the floor. She set down the scraper and pressed her fingertips to the wall below the termination line of the original wallpaper. Smooth plaster skim-coated directly onto the surface beneath. She pressed harder and moved her fingertips in a slow, horizontal line. The texture was consistent for 14 inches. Then it changed. A slight ridge, barely perceptible, running vertically from the floor upward. She followed it with her fingertips. It rose approximately 7 feet before turning at a right angle and running horizontally for 32 inches, then descending again on the other side. A frame, a standard interior door frame, sealed with plaster applied directly to the wood and finished smooth. No hardware impressions because the hardware had been removed before the plastering. The door itself was behind the plaster set into the frame opening inward. Agnes sat back on her heels and looked at the outline her fingertips had traced. She heard footsteps on the stairs. Morris Cantrell appeared in the hallway doorway and stopped. He was wearing his garden coat, a worn canvas thing he apparently kept on the hook by his front door for any occasion that required him to step outside, and he had the look of a man who had come over because he had seen the light on and had not expected to find what he was finding. He stood very still, looking at the stripped section of wall, at Agnes, on her knees, with the scraper at the emerging line of the doorframe in the plaster. Agnes looked at him. "You knew," she said. It was not an accusation. It was the same tone she used when a filing confirmed what the absence of a filing had already told her. Morris was quiet for a long moment. He looked at the wall with the expression of a man who has been holding something carefully for a very long time and is only now deciding whether the person in front of him is the right person to hand it to. "I knew Sylvia built something up here in 1971, he said. "She called it her reading room." He paused. "After she died, I never saw anyone go in. I assumed the family had cleared it." He looked at the untouched plaster, the original wallpaper, the 3 decades of layers that had accumulated over what was clearly an undisturbed seal. "Evidently not," he said. Agnes picked up her chisel. She worked the plaster carefully, following the frame lines she had traced with her fingertips, taking small sections at a time the way she had been trained to handle fragile documents. The plaster came away cleanly. Beneath it, the wood of the frame was solid and dry, the mortise and tenon joinery of the original 1931 construction, built to last by someone who did not compromise on structure. Morris stayed in the doorway. He did not offer to help. He stood with his hands clasped in front of him and watched in the manner of a man performing a specific act of witness. "Agnes," he said. His voice was very quiet. "Before you open that, you should know that Owen Varnell has been calling me every year for the past decade, asking if anyone had bought the house yet." Agnes's chisel did not stop moving. She finished the perimeter of the frame and set the chisel down and stood. She pressed her palm flat against the center of the sealed door and pushed gently. There was resistance, the resistance of a door that has been closed for a very long time and has settled into its frame, and then a soft release as the seal gave way and the door swung inward on hinges that moved without sound because they had been set in good hardware in 1931, and good hardware does not fail. The sound was a soft rush of contained air moving past her cedar warm and still carrying the particular stillness of a space that has been closed long enough that the air inside it has become its own separate atmosphere. The smell reached her. A moment later, cedar and old paper and the faint mineral trace of plaster dust, and beneath all of it something she could not name exactly, but recognized as the smell of a room that has been waiting. Agnes stood in the threshold with her flashlight and did not step in. She needed a moment. Because on the floor, just inside the threshold, positioned where it would be the first thing seen by anyone who opened the door, was a cedar chest, padlocked. The wood dark with age but solid, the brass of the padlock gone green. And on the lid a handwritten paper label in neat, careful cursive, the ink faded to brown, but every letter clear. She had seen Sylvia Varnell's signature on the original deed in the county archive. She had pulled it specifically 3 days after she made the offer to have a record of the handwriting. The handwriting on the label was the same. SV, for the record, in case. Agnes stood in the doorway of a room that had been sealed for 53 years and looked at 4 words written by a woman who had built this house in 1931 and spent the last years of her life making sure that what she knew would survive her. And she understood with the quiet certainty of someone who has spent a career reading what documents leave out that Sylvia Varnell had not sealed this room to hide what was inside. She had sealed it to protect it. Agnes stepped into the room. She did not move quickly. She stood just inside the threshold and swept her flashlight slowly across the space, the way she had learned to approach any archive room she had not been in before taking inventory, before touching, letting her eyes do the first pass of documentation. The room was 5 feet wide and 12 feet deep, narrow and purposeful in the way of spaces designed for a specific use rather than general habitation. The walls were lined with shelves on 3 sides, floor to ceiling, built from the same wood as the rest of the house, solid and level, and joined with the same careful craftsmanship she had seen in the staircase and the door frame. The shelves were empty, all of them except for the cedar chest on the floor at the center of the room, positioned with the deliberateness of something placed rather than stored. Agnes stood still and let that register. She had been expecting accumulation, the contents of a life, boxes and papers, and the ordinary sediment of 56 years in one house. What she found instead was a room that had been cleared of everything except one thing. Whatever had once been on those shelves had been removed or relocated before the room was sealed. What remained had been chosen. She noticed the ventilation channel next. A narrow cedar-lined passage running along the base of the north wall, built into the floor structure, passive but functional, designed to maintain airflow without allowing moisture ingress. The kind of detail that required planning, that required someone to think carefully about what they were preserving and what conditions that preservation required. Agnes crouched down and examined it. The cedar was dry and fragrant even after 53 years. The channel had done exactly what it was designed to do. Sylvia Varnell had not been hiding documents. She had been preserving them. Agnes straightened and took out her phone and photographed the room systematically before she touched anything. Every shelf, every wall, the floor, the ventilation channel, the cedar chest from 4 angles. She photographed the door frame, the plaster line where the seal had been the hinges. She worked the way she had worked in the archive for 35 years, documentation first handling second conclusions last. When she had 41 photographs, she put her phone away and turned her flashlight to the door frame itself. She ran her fingers along the interior face of the frame, the side that had been inside the sealed room, starting at the top and working down. Midway down the right side, her fingers found a small rectangular shape taped to the wood. A white envelope adhered with tape that had dried to brittleness over the decades, but had held. She peeled it away carefully and held it in her flashlight beam. The envelope was labeled in the same cursive she had seen on the cedar chest. The ink was faded, but the words were clear. For whoever was patient enough to measure twice. Agnes stood in the sealed room and held the envelope and did not move for a long moment. 37 years. The room had been sealed for 37 years. 3 owners had lived in this house, or attempted to, and not one of them had measured the east wing from the outside. Not one of them had stood in the upstairs hallway and counted their steps, and noticed that the numbers did not agree with each other. Not one of them had pressed their palm against the wallpaper at the end of the hall and felt the ghost of a frame underneath. Sylvia Varnell had not known who would find this. She could not have known. She had sealed the room in 1971 and spent the next 16 years of her life knowing it was there and saying nothing to anyone who would write it down. She had left the key for a person she had never met, described only by the quality of their attention. Agnes sat down on the floor of the sealed room. She sat with the envelope in her hands and the cedar smell around her, and the empty shelves on 3 walls and the cedar chest on the floor in front of her. And for the first time in this story, something moved through her that was not professional or methodical or calibrated. It was something older than that. The particular feeling of being recognized by someone who is gone, of being seen across a distance that cannot be measured in ordinary units. She had been looking carefully her entire life. In 35 years of archival work, and in the 11 visits she had made to this property before calling the listing agent, and in the 2 evenings she had spent reading the title history at her kitchen table, and in the 3 days she had spent with a measuring tape before she found Cal. She had always been the person who measured twice. She had simply never known before today that someone had been counting on exactly that. She became aware of someone in the doorway. Diane had been in the house all morning, moving between the kitchen and the upstairs rooms with the focused energy of a daughter who could not fix the situation and had decided to clean things instead. She stood now in the doorway of the room that had not existed this morning and looked at her mother sitting on the floor of it, holding a small white envelope with tears on her face that Agnes had not noticed until she saw Diane's expression change. Diane did not say anything. She slid down the doorframe and sat beside her mother on the floor of the sealed room, close enough that their shoulders touched, and she did not speak, and she did not ask questions, and she did not make any of the practical observations she had been making for the past 3 weeks. Something shifted between them in that silence. Agnes felt it and understood it was permanent. After a while, Agnes opened the envelope and found the key inside a small brass padlock key, still bright, protected by the envelope from the humidity that the cedar channel had kept at bay. She opened the padlock and lifted the lid of the cedar chest, and the cedar smell deepened, and she looked at what was inside. The documents had been wrapped in oilskin, the same preservation instinct she had seen in the copper tube at Ashwood, the understanding that paper needs protection from the long patience of time. She unwrapped the first layer carefully and found a stack of documents, each separated by a thin sheet of acid-free paper of the kind used in professional archival storage. Agnes catalogued them the way she would have in the archive, date, document type, parties involved, condition. Her hands were steady. They had always been steady. The first document was a property survey dated 1931, Sylvia Varnell's original boundary description for the Varnell house and its surrounding acreage. Condition excellent. She set it aside. The second was a correspondence file, letters between Sylvia and a Richmond law firm dated between 1983 and 1985. She noted it and set it aside. The third document stopped her. She read it once. Then she read it again, slowly following each clause to its end. It was handwritten on 4 pages of legal paper in Sylvia Varnell's careful cursive, dated September 3rd, 1987. At the top of the first page, in the same hand, a heading written with the deliberate clarity of someone who understood that the title of a document was part of its legal function. Codicil to the last will and testament of Sylvia Ann Varnell. Below the heading, a notary seal. Below that, 2 witness signatures with addresses. Below that, 4 pages of provisions in handwriting that was steady and precise and showed no indication of the deterioration that 14 weeks before death might produce in someone whose mind was failing. Agnes turned to the last page and read the execution clause and the date one more time. 14 weeks before Sylvia Varnell died. Fully executed, notarized, witnessed by 2 independent parties, and never, not once, submitted to the probate court that had settled her estate 2 months after her death in the spring of 1988. Agnes looked up at Diane. "Call your father's old attorney," she said. Her voice was quiet and entirely certain. "Not for me, for Sylvia." Sylvia Varnell sealed that room herself. She left the key for whoever was patient enough to measure twice. She had no way of knowing Agnes Wren would buy this house 37 years later. Before we read what is in that codicil, tell us in the comments what you think Sylvia left behind. And why do you think her family never submitted it to probate? Judith Parr arrived at 11:45 with her reading glasses already on. Agnes had called her from the sealed room, still sitting on the floor beside Diane, speaking quietly and precisely in the way she spoke when she needed something done without explanation. Judith had asked 2 questions, confirmed the address, and said she would be there within the hour. She arrived in 50 minutes carrying a canvas bag that clinked with the particular sound of archival supplies, the kind of woman who keeps acid-free sleeves and cotton handling gloves in her car the way other people keep jumper cables. Agnes had the documents laid out on the kitchen table by the time Judith walked through the door. Each one photographed, cataloged in Agnes's notepad, separated by the acid-free paper from Sylvia's own supply that she had found lining the cedar chest. The cedar chest itself sat open on the floor, nearby, empty, now its contents organized on the table, with the care they had been waiting 37 years to receive. Judith set her bag down and stood at the table and looked at the arrangement for a moment before she touched anything. "You cataloged before handling," she said. Agnes nodded. "Good," Judith said. She pulled on her cotton gloves and picked up the codicil first. She read it the way Agnes had read it, slowly, and in order, following the structure of the document rather than skimming for the highlights. Agnes waited. Diane stood in the kitchen doorway with her arms crossed and watched Judith read with the expression of someone who has stopped being skeptical and started being afraid of what certainty looks like. The codicil was 4 handwritten pages in Sylvia Varnell's careful schoolteacher cursive. The provisions were specific and unambiguous. A cash bequest of $40,000 to the Kettle Creek Public Library Endowment Fund, drawn from the savings account whose number Sylvia had included in full. And the personal contents of the Varnell house defined broadly, to include all documents, records, furnishings, and archival materials contained within the property at the time of sale, left to any person of scholarly disposition who purchases this property in good faith and cares for it accordingly. Not a name, a description. Agnes had read that provision 4 times before she understood what it meant. Sylvia had not known who would come. She had described them instead. And the description fit Agnes Wren with the precision of something written specifically for her, which it had not been, which made it more extraordinary, not less. Judith set the codicil down and picked up the personal journal. It was a standard composition notebook, the kind used in schoolrooms, which made sense for a former elementary school principal. The entries ran from January of 1983 to November of 1987, 6 weeks before Sylvia's death. Judith turned to the middle section and read for several minutes. Agnes watched her face. The entries for 1986 and 1987 were written in the same steady hand as the earlier pages. No deterioration of script, no confusion of dates, no repetition or wandering that might suggest cognitive decline. What they contained was a quiet and meticulous account of a woman in her late 70s watching the people around her make decisions about her life and her property without her knowledge or consent, and choosing because she did not have the energy for open conflict to do what she had always done. Document everything. I do not have the energy to fight this in court, she had written on the 14th of March, 1987, in the same even cursive she had used to teach children how to form their letters for 3 decades. But I can make sure the truth is findable for the right person at the right time. Judith set the journal down carefully and did not speak for a moment. Then she picked up the mineral rights transfer deed. Agnes watched something change in Judith's posture as she read it. A subtle shift, the kind that happens when a person who knows a great deal about a subject encounters a document that lands in the center of that knowledge with unexpected weight. Judith's finger moved slowly down the page, tracing the legal description of the transferred parcel. She stopped at the consideration line. $1, Agnes said quietly. Judith looked up at her over the reading glasses. Nominal consideration, Agnes continued. Transferred in 1985 from the Varnell family mineral rights, holding to a private company called Shenandoah Basin Properties, LLC. Sylvia's son is listed as the transferring party. Sylvia's co-signature, which her attorney advised in the letter at the bottom of the stack, is not present. Judith set the deed down and picked up the attorney's letter. She read it once. It was 2 paragraphs, professional and careful, in the way of a lawyer writing to a client about a concern they want documented but do not want to alarm. The mineral rights to the adjacent parcel, the letter noted, were held jointly under the original Varnell family deed. A transfer of any portion of those rights would typically require the co-signature of all parties holding an interest. The attorney had advised Sylvia to request clarification before signing anything. Sylvia's son had told her she did not need to worry about it. Judith took off her reading glasses and set them on the table beside the deed and looked at Agnes. "Do you know what parcel this describes?" she said. Agnes looked at her notepad. The legal description from the deed. She had copied it exactly. Judith reached into her canvas bag and pulled out a folded county map, the kind the Historical Society kept for reference, and spread it on the table beside the documents. She found the parcel boundaries from the deed description and traced them with her finger. The adjacent parcel, she said, running her finger along the boundary line, sits directly over the Shenandoah Valley Natural Gas Corridor. She looked up. The 2019 Geological Survey. You'll have read about it. Agnes had read about it. Everyone in the county who paid attention to property records had read about it. A significant natural gas formation running beneath a corridor of Shenandoah Valley land, identified in a federal geological survey in 2019 that had made certain mineral rights holdings in the region worth considerably more than they had been the previous week. Judith's finger rested on the parcel. Current estimated value of the mineral rights to this parcel, Judith said, based on the 2019 survey assessments and the subsequent rights transactions in this corridor, is approximately $2.3 million. The kitchen was very quiet. Agnes looked at the mineral rights deed. $1, nominal consideration, 1985, a transfer that Sylvia's own attorney had flagged as potentially invalid without her co-signature. A transfer that Sylvia had documented in her journal with the same meticulous care she had brought to everything, recording what had happened and who had said what, and what she had not been told, and then sealing the documentation in a cedar chest in a room she had built to last until the right person came along with a measuring tape and enough patience to press their palm against a wall and feel what was underneath. The door of the adjacent room that had contained this document had been sealed for 37 years. Owen Varnell had been watching this property for 10 years. He had known about the 2019 survey. He had known about the mineral rights. He had known or suspected that Sylvia had documented the 1985 transfer, and he had made his cash offer within 48 hours of the deed recording, because he needed to get inside this house before Agnes read anything closely enough to understand what she had. Judith looked up from the map. She looked at the kitchen window. "Agnes," she said. Her voice was very quiet. "He is coming." Agnes looked up. Through the kitchen window, moving slowly up the driveway of the Varnell house, a silver SUV with Richmond plates came to a stop behind Agnes's car. The driver's door opened. Owen Varnell had not waited for an answer to his letter. Owen Varnell knocked at 2:17 in the afternoon. Agnes had seen him coming up the front walk from the kitchen window and had taken 30 seconds to look at the table, at the documents in their archival sleeves, at Judith's notepad and her own at the cedar chest on the floor. She had straightened one sleeve that did not need straightening. Then she had walked to the front door and opened it. He was not what she had expected, which meant she had expected correctly. Owen Varnell was 52 years old and carried it well, the kind of man who had learned early that presentation was its own form of argument. His coat was good wool, his shoes were city shoes, inappropriate for the gravel driveway, and his smile arrived before he spoke and stayed after the words ran out. He had the practiced ease of someone who negotiated for a living and had learned to make negotiation feel like conversation. "Mrs. Wren," he said, "I apologize for dropping by without calling ahead. I heard the property had finally sold, and I wanted to come in person rather than leave this to correspondence." Agnes looked at him. He explained that he had a sentimental attachment to his grandmother's home, that the Varnell house represented an important part of his family history, and that he understood she had begun some renovation work, and he hoped she hadn't found the place too challenging. He said all of this with the warmth of someone who has rehearsed warmth until it sounds unrehearsed. Then he said that if she had come across any personal effects or documents in the course of her work, anything that might have belonged to the family, he would be very grateful for the opportunity to reclaim them. As a family matter, as a courtesy. He smiled again at the end of it. Agnes looked at him for a long moment. "Would you like to come in, Mr. Varnell?" she said. She stepped back from the door and he came in. She led him through the front room and down the hall to the kitchen, and she watched the precise moment when he saw the table. His stride did not break. His expression did not change. But something happened in the half-second after his eyes registered what was in front of him, the documents in their archival sleeves, the two notepads, Judith Parr, sitting with her reading glasses on, and her hands folded, and the cedar chest open on the floor. Something behind his eyes recalibrated and then settled into a stillness that was not the same as the ease he had walked in with. The smile stayed, but the thing behind it did not. "Judith," he said. He nodded at her with the familiarity of someone who knows a person by reputation in a small county. "Owen," Judith said. She did not smile. Agnes gestured to the chair across the table, and Owen sat down and looked at the documents between them with the expression of a man deciding how much he already knows versus how much he should appear to know. "I appreciate you coming inside," Agnes said. She sat across from him. She placed her hand flat on the table beside the archival sleeves, not on them, beside them. A gesture of adjacency rather than possession, though the distinction was clear. "I think you may have come about these." Owen looked at her hand. He looked at the sleeves. He looked at the cedar chest. Then he pivoted. The documents, he said, his voice taking on a different register, still pleasant but with a professional firmness underneath it now, were Varnell family property. They were personal papers belonging to his grandmother's estate. They had never been legally transferred as part of any property sale, and the fact that they were found on the premises did not alter their ownership status. As the sole surviving Varnell heir, he was entitled to claim them, and he was prepared to do so through whatever process Agnes felt was appropriate. He said it well. He had clearly said it before, or something like it, in the preparation he had been doing for this moment for 10 years. Agnes looked at him while he spoke. When he finished, she let the silence sit for a moment. These documents, she said, were preserved inside a sealed room that was built as an integral structural component of this property in 1971 and has remained sealed and undisturbed as part of the physical structure of the Varnell house since that date. They were contained within a space I purchased as part of the property. She paused. "I would be happy to discuss this further with your attorney, Mr. Varnell. My attorney will be available tomorrow morning." Owen looked at her hand on the table. He looked at Judith. Judith looked back at him with the expression of a woman who has spent 30 years reading every deed in a county going back to 1820 and is not in the habit of being rushed. Owen looked at the window. Through it, the silver SUV in the driveway. Beyond it, Morris Cantrell, standing in his own driveway next door with his arms crossed, not approaching, not gesturing, simply present in the way of a man who has been a neighbor for 45 years and understands that bearing witness is its own form of standing with someone. Owen was quiet for a moment. Then he gathered himself in the way of someone who has not won the room, but has decided not to lose it visibly either. He talked for several more minutes. He made 3 more variations of the same argument in decreasing order of confidence. Agnes listened to all of them with the same expression she brought to documents that contained errors she had already identified, patient, attentive, giving the material the courtesy of being heard completely before being addressed. She did not move her hand from the table. When Owen finished, she said the same thing she had said before in slightly different words. Her attorney. Tomorrow morning. She would be happy to have that conversation. Owen stood. He straightened his coat. He looked at the cedar chest one more time in a way he probably believed was not obvious. He walked to the front door and Agnes followed him. On the porch he stopped with his hand on the railing and turned back to her with the expression of a man making a final offer. He is prepared for exactly this contingency. She always liked complicated people, he said. Sylvia, I suppose she found one. Agnes looked at him. He went down the porch steps and across the gravel to the silver SUV, and she watched him back out of the driveway without looking toward Morris, who was still standing in his own yard, with his arms crossed, still watching, and drive away in the direction of the county road. Agnes closed the front door. She stood with her back against it for a moment in the hallway of the Varnell house in the smell of old wood and cedar, and the particular stillness of a house that has been keeping something carefully for a long time, and she breathed. Then she walked back to the kitchen. How long, she said to Judith, does the Attorney General's office take to respond? Judith looked up from the mineral rights deed. I called them 20 minutes ago, she said. They already called back. Sylvia Varnell was 79 years old when she sealed that room. She did not fight her family in open court. She documented everything carefully and made sure the truth was findable for the right person at the right time. If this story is moving you the way it is moving us, hit the like button and share it with someone who needs to hear that patience and precision are their own kind of justice. Renata Solis drove up from Charlottesville on a Wednesday morning and arrived at the Varnell house at 9:15 with a leather briefcase and the particular focused energy of a woman who has spent 28 years in property and estate law and has learned to read a room before she reads a document. Agnes had the cedar chest contents laid out on the kitchen table in the same order she had catalogued them. Renata set her briefcase down and looked at the arrangement, and then looked at Agnes with an expression that said she understood she was working with someone who knew how documents were supposed to be handled. She put on her reading glasses and picked up the mineral rights transfer deed. She read it once without speaking. Then she went to her briefcase and took out a magnifying glass and read it again, slowly moving the glass along each line with the patience of someone who is not looking for the general picture, but for the specific detail that will determine everything. She stopped at the signature line. Agnes, she said, I need the original Varnell family deed and every document in this chest that contains Sylvia Varnell's signature. Agnes had them ready. She had anticipated this the night before and had arranged the signature documents in chronological order, the earliest first, the comparison clearest from the progression. She slid them across the table one at a time. Renata laid them beside the transfer deed and looked at them under the magnifying glass for a long time. The kitchen was quiet except for the sound of Morris's lawnmower starting next door and then stopping again, as if he too was paying attention. Renata set down the magnifying glass. The signature on the transfer deed, she said, is not Sylvia Varnell's signature. Agnes had known since the night before. She had looked at the comparison documents under her own reading glasses for an hour after Diane had gone to bed, following the particular way Sylvia formed her capital Vive, the angle of the crossbar on her T, the consistent slight leftward lean of her cursive that appeared in every document she had ever signed, going back to the original 1931 deed. The signature on the transfer deed had the right general shape. It did not have the right hand behind it. Renata continued without editorializing the way a professional presents findings that have legal weight and do not require emotional emphasis to be understood. The 1985 transfer had 3 legal problems, each one sufficient on its own, together making the transfer extraordinarily difficult to defend. The first was the forged signature. Under the joint tenancy structure of the original Varnell family deed, Sylvia's co-signature was legally required for any transfer of the mineral rights interest. The signature present on the 1985 deed was not hers. The second problem was the recipient. Shenandoah Basin Properties, Alnianseekin LLC was a holding company controlled by Sylvia's son, making the transaction a self-dealing transfer executed without legal disclosure to the other party in interest. The third problem was procedural. The transfer had never been properly recorded against the primary parcel in the Kettle Creek County land records. It existed as a filed instrument, but the recording against the parcel itself had been incomplete, leaving the mineral rights ownership legally ambiguous for 40 years in a way that no title search had ever fully resolved. Renata set her pen down and looked at Agnes. With the 2019 Natural Gas Corridor Survey and the subsequent valuations of mineral rights in this region, she said, "The unresolved interest in this parcel is currently valued by independent appraisal at $2.3 million. Agnes looked at Sylvia's journal open on the table to the 1986 entry, the handwriting steady and clear, the words of a woman who had known exactly what was being done to her and had made a choice about how to respond to it. "Documents don't lie," Agnes said. "People do." Renata looked at her. Sylvia knew that Agnes said, "It's why she kept everything." Renata's phone rang at 2:40 in the afternoon. She stepped into the front room to take it and was back in 4 minutes. She sat down across from Agnes and looked at her notepad for a moment before speaking. "That was Owen's attorney," she said. "They are offering a settlement. $400,000 to you in exchange for the cedar chest contents and a signed non-disclosure agreement." Agnes looked out the kitchen window at the overgrown garden. The boxwood's gone leggy, the bed's overtaken, but the bones of it still visible, underneath the lines of a garden that had been planned carefully by someone who knew what she was doing. "Tell them we will respond in writing," Agnes said. Renata wrote that down. Agnes looked at her. "Judith," she said, "does the County Historical Society have an endowment fund?" Judith looked up from her own notepad across the table. "We do," she said carefully. Agnes turned back to Renata. "The codicil directs $40,000 to the Kettle Creek Public Library Endowment," she said. "That was 1987. The document has never been submitted to probate. If you petition to have it admitted now, Sylvia's wishes can still be carried out." 37 years late, but carried out. Renata looked at the codicil in its archival sleeve. "That is a separate proceeding from the mineral rights matter," she said. "And the mineral rights fraud is a separate civil action again. Agnes, I want to be clear with you. The civil action arising from the fraudulent transfer does not belong to you. It arises from what was done to Sylvia Varnell in 1985. Her estate, once the codicil is admitted to probate, is the relevant legal entity. You are not the plaintiff in that action." Agnes nodded once. "I know," she said. "I am not doing this for myself." Renata filed the probate petition on a Thursday afternoon. The paperwork was precise and complete and accompanied by the original codicil, the notarization documentation, the witness statements, and a full archival record of the cedar chest contents prepared by Agnes to the standard of a county archive submission. By Friday morning, the Virginia State Attorney General's office, acting on Judith's call from 6 days earlier and the subsequent documentation Renata had forwarded, had opened a formal inquiry into the 1985 mineral rights transfer. Owen Varnell's attorney did not return Renata's call that day, or the next. Agnes spent the weekend in the garden. It was the first time since she had bought the house that she worked outside, rather than in, and she worked the way she worked everything methodically, starting at one end and moving in one direction, clearing the overgrowth section by section without hurrying. The boxwoods came back into shape with pruning. The bed lines emerged from under 25 years of encroachment. On Saturday afternoon, working along the south wall of the garden, she found them. Rose bushes. Old ones, the canes thick and woody with age, buried under a tangle of ornamental grass that had seeded itself over them season by season for a quarter century. She cleared around the base of the first one carefully and found the growth still green underneath the dead wood. Then the second, then the third and the fourth and the fifth, all of them alive. Every one of Sylvia Varnell's original rose bushes still rooted, still growing in the dark, underneath everything that had grown over them, waiting with the particular patience of things that are well planted and have not forgotten what they are. Agnes sat back on her heels in the garden of the Varnell house and looked at the rose bushes she had uncovered and felt the specific quality of a Saturday afternoon in a place that is beginning after a very long time to be cared for again. The probate court admitted Sylvia Varnell's codicil on a Tuesday morning in late November. Renata called Agnes at 9:43 and read the ruling in the measured professional tone she used for delivering outcomes that were correct and had simply taken longer than they should have. Agnes was in the garden when the call came, working along the east bed, where the last of the ornamental grass was still coming out in sections, and she sat down on the low stone wall that edged the garden and listened to Renata read, and looked at Sylvia's rose bushes bare now in the November light, but rooted and alive, and said very little. The $40,000 bequest to the Kettle Creek Public Library Endowment Fund was the starting point. Renata had worked with the probate court to apply a standard inflation adjustment for the 37 years since the codicil was written, bringing the base figure to $61,000. The County Historical Society, at Judith's quiet recommendation and without public announcement, contributed the remainder to bring the total to $75,000. The gift was designated for a permanent endowment in Sylvia Varnell's name, the interest to support the library's archival and historical collection in perpetuity. Judith called Agnes the afternoon the library accepted the gift. She always wanted the library to outlast her, Judith said. She served on the board for 20 years, and every year she asked the same question at the annual meeting. What are we doing to make sure this collection is here in 100 years? Judith paused. Now it will be. The mineral rights civil action moved through state mediation over the following 6 weeks. The forensic comparison of Sylvia's signatures, prepared by Renata and supported by Agnes's archival documentation, established the forgery with the clarity of evidence that has been preserved carefully for exactly this purpose. The self-dealing structure of the 1985 transfer and the incomplete county recording provided the additional legal basis. Owen Varnell's attorney entered settlement discussions in the second week of mediation and did not leave them. The fraudulent transfer was voided. The mineral rights reverted to the Varnell estate. Because Sylvia's son had been the instrument of the fraud and Owen was his direct heir, the state applied the estate escheat protocol to the reverted rights. The mineral rights to the parcel above the Shenandoah Valley natural gas corridor, valued at $2.3 million by independent appraisal, were transferred to the Kettle Creek County Historical Preservation Trust. Agnes did not receive $1 of it. She did not ask to. Renata had raised the question once carefully, in the way of an attorney who wants her client to understand all available options before declining them. Agnes had listened and then said that the documents had belonged to Sylvia Varnell. The truth in them had belonged to Sylvia Varnell, and the justice that came from them belonged to whatever Sylvia had intended when she wrote 4 words on a paper label and left a key for someone she had never met. Renata had written that down and closed her notepad and said she understood. Diane came the weekend after the probate ruling. She had been coming most weekends since the day she had slid down the doorframe and sat beside her mother on the floor of the sealed room, and something in the quality of her presence had changed in a way that neither of them had named directly. She was still practical and still competent, and still occasionally said things about structural assessments and resale value that Agnes absorbed without comment. But she had stopped standing in doorways with her arms crossed. She walked through the rooms of the Varnell house now the way you walk through a place you have accepted, taking it on its own terms. On Saturday afternoon she climbed to the second floor and stopped in the doorway of the room. It was open now, the door Agnes had unsealed still swung wide, the plaster dust long since cleaned from the floor. Agnes had put up 2 small shelves on the west wall and begun filling them with her own archival collection, the things she had accumulated over 35 years in the county archive that had nowhere particular to live until now. Sylvia's cedar chest sat on the center shelf, cleaned and oiled, the padlock open and hanging from the hasp. The small window at the back of the room that Agnes had found behind a false wall panel admitted a shaft of afternoon light that moved across the floor as the day progressed. Diane stood in the doorway for a long moment. "You knew the whole time, didn't you?" she said. "Before you even made the offer." Agnes was standing at the west shelf, arranging a row of county survey maps in archival sleeves. "I knew there was something here that was supposed to be found," she said. Diane looked at the cedar chest on the shelf, at the open padlock, at the small envelope, the one labeled for whoever was patient enough to measure twice, which Agnes had placed beside the chest where it could be seen. "That is not the same as knowing," Diane said. Agnes considered this. "No," she said, "but for me it was enough." Diane was quiet for a moment. She looked at the shaft of afternoon light on the floor of the room. She looked at her mother's hands, the archivist's hands arranging the survey maps with the same care they had used to lift documents from a cedar chest on a Thursday morning that had changed both of their lives in ways they were still understanding. Then she walked in and picked up one end of the shelf Agnes had been trying to level for a week and held it steady while Agnes marked the wall. The sealed room had not been built in 1971 out of secrecy or fear. Agnes had understood this from the beginning, from the moment she had stood in the threshold and seen the empty shelves and the ventilation channel and the cedar chest centered on the floor, with the deliberateness of something placed rather than hidden. Sylvia Varnell had built this room as a personal archive, a place for the things that mattered, records, letters, truth, the objects of a careful life kept by a woman who believed that what you document precisely will outlast what you merely remember. When the betrayal came in 1985, the room was already there. She had simply used it for its highest purpose. She had not known who would find it. She had built it knowing that someone eventually would. Someone who measured twice, who read what was missing as carefully as what was present, who would honor the intention behind the documents rather than fold them into their own advantage. She had described that person without knowing her name. Agnes Wren had spent her entire career being that person in a county archive where nobody was watching. She had simply not known until a Tuesday in October that someone had been counting on it. On a cold Saturday in December, Agnes drove to the Kettle Creek Public Library for the dedication of the new reading room. The room was small and well lit, with good shelving along 3 walls and a reading table at the center that could seat 6. Beside the entrance, a small bronze plaque mounted at eye level. Sylvia M. Varnell Reading Room, endowed 2024. Agnes stood in front of it for a moment. Then she went inside and sat at the reading table and ran her hand along the surface the way she had run her hand along the surface of the kitchen table at the Varnell house. And she thought about a woman she had never met who had trusted a stranger she would never know to do the right thing with what she had preserved. Morris was in his garden when she got home. He looked up when her car turned into the Varnell driveway the way he had looked up every time a car turned into that driveway for 45 years, the particular attention of a man keeping a long watch. But the quality of it was different now. The vigilance was gone. What remained was something quieter, the look of a man who has been released from a responsibility he carried faithfully, and is only now in the release allowing himself to feel how long he carried it. He raised one hand. Agnes raised hers back. She went through the side gate into the garden in the evening light and walked the beds she had been clearing since October. The boxwoods shaped the bed lines, restored the ground turned and ready for spring. And along the south wall, Sylvia's rose bushes bare in the December cold, but alive in every cane, holding their form against the wall, the way well-rooted things hold their form through whatever comes over them. They would bloom in May. Agnes already knew what she would do when they did. The crumbling old house that nobody wanted for 25 years. Agnes Wren spent every dollar she had on it, not because she knew what was inside, but because she knew how to read what was not there, and that, it turns out, was exactly the kind of person Sylvia Varnell had been waiting for. Agnes did not find that room by accident. She found it because she paid attention to what was missing, and she trusted that silence can hold a story just as well as words can. Every week on this channel, we find another old house that has been keeping a secret and the person who finally understood it. Subscribe and turn on the bell, because next week's story starts with a farmhouse that passed through 6 different families in 40 years. None of them ever used the room above the barn, and none of them ever asked why the previous owners always left in winter.